Today is Tuesday, April 7th. This is VOA's International Edition. I'm Lori Lunden in Washington. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has taken a turn for the worse in his battle with the coronavirus.
The Prime Minister's condition worsened, and on the advice of the medical team, he was moved in to a critical care unit.
The World Health Organization urges caution in relaxing lockdown strategies. Also ahead, music stars from across the globe are set to stage a live fundraising concert in the fight against COVID-19. It's all on today's International Edition. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has been moved to the intensive care unit of a London hospital after his coronavirus symptoms worsened. Johnson was admitted to St. Thomas's Hospital late Sunday, 10 days after he was diagnosed with COVID-19. Johnson has asked Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab to deputize for him.
The Prime Minister's condition worsened, and on the advice of the medical team, he was moved in to a critical care unit. So in light of those circumstances, the Prime Minister asked me as First Secretary to deputise for him where necessary in driving forward the government's plans to defeat coronavirus.
For more on Johnson's condition now, we are joined by reporter Amy Gutman in London. Amy, what can you tell us?
There's been no announcement of a change in the Prime Minister's medical condition or medical state. The notion is that he has been admitted to the ICU, the intensive care unit, as a precautionary measure. We know for certain that he's not on a ventilator at this stage and that he is conscious, because this evening after he was admitted to hospital, he called the Foreign Minister Dominic Raab to hand over day-to-day prime ministerial operations, not powers, to Dominic Raab. So he wouldn't be able to do that if he wasn't conscious, and he certainly wouldn't be able to do that if he was on a ventilator. So it's believed that this is a precautionary measure.
It does seem like it would be serious if he went in and, given the circumstances, to be using an ICU bed if it wasn't somewhat concerning.
There's no question that Boris Johnson being admitted to hospital first and then to the ICU is absolutely serious. There's no question about that at all. And there's no question that Boris Johnson taking the measure of calling his Foreign Minister Dominic Raab to hand over day-to-day operational duties is also a significant step change in what we've seen so far. Because remember, the Prime Minister has had this diagnosis of the coronavirus for the last 10 days. Now, he's been self-isolating and his condition was not getting better. In fact, we saw pictures of him in an interview late last week that was recorded from his home, and he was not looking good. He was looking very pale, very pallid. He had lost a lot of weight. A lot of people get better at the 7-day point, and he seemed to be getting worse, which can also happen. So it's been 10 days now. So the prevailing notion is that he was admitted to hospital again as a precautionary measure because he should really be getting better at this stage. And if he's not, there is great concern based on what doctors know about other people who have suffered from this virus that perhaps he will take a more rapid turn. But again, this is just speculation. Being admitted to ICU, there may be concern that the next step could be that his condition could worsen, necessitating the use of a ventilator. But again, it's important to note he has transferred the carrying out of his duties.
Can you explain the difference of handing over day-to-day operations versus power? And what if he does take a turn for the worse and is not able to be in control of the government? Then who takes over? What's the chain of command there?
The chain of command is that the Foreign Minister, Dominic Raab, who he called to transfer the carrying out of day-to-day operations, would take over in that prime ministerial operational role. Now, the difference between the duties versus the powers is exactly that. So carrying out the duties means that Dominic Raab has to continue consulting with Boris Johnson about decisions. So operational decisions, as well as any serious critical decisions that would be made by the Prime Minister, have to be run past the Prime Minister. That's Boris Johnson. So this doesn't empower the foreign minister to all of a sudden replace Boris Johnson or be a surrogate for Boris Johnson. This simply means that he will carry out and execute Boris Johnson's duties and his wishes, and again, will consult with Boris Johnson on any critical decisions that need to be made. Now, if Boris Johnson were to take a more serious turn here and be in a much more grave condition, then yes, the foreign minister would need to be empowered to carry out prime ministerial powers, and then he would essentially be a surrogate for Boris Johnson, and he would be able to make those decisions, as in that circumstance, Boris Johnson would be incapacitated.
That's reporter Amy Gutman in London. Thank you. Well, Britons are bracing for one of their darkest weeks in living memory as the social and financial toll of the coronavirus pandemic deepens. But Italy, Spain, and France are now seeing signs that they are flattening the pandemic curve. This as European nations and the European Union begin working on a plan to open back up and deal with the enormous economic impacts when it's all over. Joining us now from France is Paris-based journalist Catherine Field.
It's really the member states who are dealing with this. And we're seeing various countries dealing with or trying to deal with some sort of structure that would bring their population out of lockdown. So, for example, Austria, the Austrian Chancellor has come out and said that the aim is by April 14th, there will be strict security conditions, there will still be social distancing, but very much relying on the population controlling themselves, not deciding that come April 14th they can go and party. In Germany, pretty much the same message again there too. Chancellor Angela Merkel said on Monday that she can envisage a time when people will be able to get back to some sort of life, normal life again, but that there may be obligations, and we're seeing there as well, and perhaps an obligation to wear masks in public, still limits on public gatherings, and those are the sort of decisions that European countries are starting to have to deal with. And another issue they're having to deal with is that the cases are really very much in a lot of the metropolitan areas. For example, in France, there's a lot in the Paris area, but in the outlying districts and regions, there are much fewer cases. So we're also looking at the possibility of some parts of, say, for example, France and Germany really going back to something like a normal life, while you're getting these big metropolitan areas are still going to be under some sort of lockdown. Certainly the next question is going to be, though, how are you going to deal with citizens' movements?
Right.
Well, one of the ideas being put around is that people's telephones, mobile phones will have tracking apps. And those apps will trace citizens' movements, ensure they're not breaking curfew rules, and make sure that they're staying away from infected people. So that in particular is again going to come up to some very interesting questions on how much information the government will have in these countries about where each person is going, and just how much of a track these apps will have on citizens' movements.
Right, and of course we know in Europe, movement from country to country, not just from one city or part of France as well.
The EU is trying to figure out some sort of way that you can get citizens' movements going again, but not losing so much of the battle that's been won thus far with the health of its people. So this is a big problem, a particularly big problem at the moment, because you've got in the agriculture sector where there's meant to be people working on these big farms. That's not happening. So the EU is trying to, on the one hand, figure out how people will be able to move again, and that will include lifting some of the border restrictions that we've seen come in place over the last month, and also questioning whether people are going to exactly the right places, so as we don't end up with too many people in one area and then having an outbreak there and not enough people in another area. It's a very complicated picture, and I think we're going to see by about the end of this week, after a whole range of European Union meetings, we're going to start seeing a clearer picture of how Europe is going to deal with what's become known as a sort of a post-lockdown world, which will happen very gradually.
What is the EU planning to help with economic recovery?
The economic recovery is the big issue for small European and large European states. And when you look at most of them are now looking at the possibility of the worst post-war economic downturns that are going to be way beyond what anyone imagined, certainly well beyond 3-4% contraction of the economy. So looking around at what the European Commission is doing, they're looking at giving direct grants to companies. Those could be up to 800,000 euros for each company. They're going to be subsidizing state guarantees on bank loans. You're going to have small and medium-sized businesses being given subsidized interest rates. And the sort of money we're talking about is really almost unknown in Europe. You're talking about 37 billion euros being put aside by the European Union to go to help small businesses. You've got another 28 billion being put aside to help businesses restructure.
Paris-based journalist Catherine Field, thanks so much for being with us. In the U.S., President Donald Trump said in an afternoon briefing Monday that Americans should be prepared for a difficult few weeks.
The progress has been made before the surge comes, because the next week and a half is going to be a big surge, the professionals tell us, and I think we're in good shape for it.
He also said he received a call from former Vice President Joe Biden, the Democratic presidential frontrunner, who offered his advice from the past administration's experiences.
He gave me his point of view, and I fully understood that. And we just had a very friendly conversation. Lasted probably 15 minutes. And it was really good. It was really good. Really nice. I think it was very much so. I appreciate his calling.
Meanwhile, New York City remains the epicenter of the pandemic in the U.S. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo suggested the crisis may be plateauing.
Total number of hospitalizations are down, the ICU admissions are down, and the daily intubations are down. Those are all good signs, and again would suggest a possible flattening of the curve.
But he also warned against complacency and extended stay-at-home restrictions and the continued closure of schools and non-essential businesses through the end of the month. He stressed that even if New York has reached peak, numbers could persist, and this will help the state avoid a worst-case catastrophe.
The numbers look like they may be turning. Yay, it's over. No, it's not. And other places have made that mistake. Hong Kong has made that mistake. South Korea has made that mistake. And we're not going to make that mistake.
While hospitalizations are down, the number of coronavirus cases in the state increased by 7%. The World Health Organization's emergencies chief said countries looking to exit their lockdown strategies need to use a calibrated, stepwise approach that does not release all of the restrictions at once. Here are some of the other top pandemic stories we are following from around the world. The organization that handles claims on behalf of Jewish victims of Nazis announced Monday that millions of dollars in additional funds are being made available to agencies around the world that provide aid to Holocaust survivors whose advanced age and health issues make them particularly vulnerable to the new coronavirus. The World Health Organization Monday denounced racist remarks by two French scientists for suggesting coronavirus vaccine testing should be carried out in Africa. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, an Ethiopian who is the first WHO Director General from Africa, decried what he described as a hangover from a colonial mentality at a time when he is urging solidarity among countries. And J.K. Rowling, the author of the Harry Potter book, says she has now fully recovered from what she believes to have been coronavirus. Rowling said in a tweet that she has not been tested, but that she had displayed all symptoms of the virus over the past 2 weeks. Stay with VOA for all the latest on the coronavirus pandemic. Kenya's president on Monday ordered a halt to all transport in major cities, including the capital Nairobi, to curb the spread of the coronavirus. The president announced the measures after 16 more people were confirmed to test positive, bringing the total number of COVID-19 cases in Kenya to 158.